I said, Chief, do you believe cybersecurity is an issue in within the service? And he says, no. So I live hacked the police chief at that moment.
All right, amazing. So, welcome back to our episode 2 of the Beyond Today podcast. It's been a long time coming, but really happy to kind of get our second episode going. I am very thrilled to introduce someone who is also extremely befitting of an innovation podcast. He is a fellow U Ottawa law alum and also a U of T alum as well. To Vidit, Ritesh Kotak. I first met Ritesh during my initial week of law school, and it was at a reception held at the Supreme Court. So it's actually really awesome to have the opportunity to kind of speak with him today. It feels like a really big full circle moment. And yeah, I mean, Ritesh has had very humble beginnings, and it's very interesting because, he's now a figure who, I view at least to be almost larger than life in a way. I know that might sound a little bit awkward to Ritesh, but that is how I view it, especially with the work and the influence that you have, especially in the public space and how people value the kinds of contributions that you have to the field. And obviously, you're still one of the most down to earth and humble people that I know. So honestly, you've kind of set me on my journey, and the fact that this podcast exists is largely attributed to, me taking inspiration from the work that you do, and from meeting you that day. So really feels like a great full circle moment, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to kind of share this conversation with you, Ritesh. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me and just that intro, right? And I think
Mhm.
I remember from the first time we met on the lawn of the Supreme Court, I just knew that you're going to be doing great things and you're getting started in your legal career as a law student doing these podcasts. And I think that shows initiatives, and both of you should be applauded for that.
Thank you so much. Like we really appreciate that. I'm sure I speak for Vidit when I extend my thanks for that as well. I mean, I would love for you to kind of share some of like the work that you do, some of your background, things that you might feel is relevant for the audience, and then we can obviously turn the conversation from there.
Yeah, well, I'll start off by saying I actually never thought I was ever going to be a lawyer. Lawyering is probably my third or fourth career. I actually started off, my family actually started off in the food manufacturing business. And I remember growing up, my parents owned a somewhat of a convenience store and then a bulk food store. And then we would make cashews and spices, and my sister and I would go out into the market and sell it, Kensington Market in Toronto to be specific. And that's kind of how this idea of entrepreneurialism, this idea of innovation started, because I grew up in a small business. We didn't have money to hire IT professionals. We didn't have money to hire individuals that, like consultants, for example. When you're a small business owner, you are the IT person, you are the consultant, you are the salesperson. And that's the environment I grew up in. It was after school and on weekends. It wasn't go out and play video games and do what was normal. Normal for myself and my sister was to go to the family business and work, literally roll up our sleeves and offload skids and hand package stuff and be on the cash register, stock the shelves. So that's kind of how it started. So I've always had this idea of entrepreneurialism, this idea of innovation, because it was more by necessity and survival than it was by passion in the beginning. So I kind of went on that journey. I went to the University of Toronto. I did a BBA. And while I was doing that, the Toronto police were recruiting in there when I was in my fourth year. And I was interested and I applied. And I remember graduating after 4 years of torture at U of T. I remember graduating and I was given two options: one, to join the Big Four to be a financial analyst, kind of put that BBA to good use, or the second was to join the Toronto Police Service. And I actually took the Toronto Police Service. I actually remember going home and telling my mom that I got these two offers, and she hugged me and kissed me and said, "I'm so proud my son's going to be an accountant." Obviously, I think I've been a failure to her. No, I haven't been a failure, but that's kind of how it started. When I was in the police service, I had obviously I understood tech, I understood hard work. I was a member of the service, and opportunities started coming up. This is when I first got in around 2010. This is when social media was taking off. This is when we started hearing more about breaches. So very quickly, my work turned to cyber crimes, protecting people. Also got to do a lot of work with some of the investigative units, so the intelligence division, organized crime, stuff like that. Always from like a tech angle. It was a tech and policing angle. So it was really interesting because these jobs really didn't exist back in 2010, 2011, 2012. They were just being formed. And the way the first cyber crimes unit was formed, and this is an interesting story, is I got a meeting with, at that time, the deputy chiefs and the chief of police. And the chief of police was Bill Blair, who's now actually the Minister of National Defense in Canada. And I remember at that time I was really young. I think I was like 23, 24. And I'm meeting with the command structure of the largest municipal police service in Canada. And I remember turning to the chief, and he shares the story publicly. And I said, "Chief, do you believe cybersecurity is an issue in within the service?" And he says, "No." So I live hacked the police chief at that moment. And instead of getting fired or arrested or whatever, he says, "Well, Ritesh, we got to solve this, and I want you to solve this problem and pick your team." So right away, that's how the cyber crimes division got started, and that's kind of that TSN turning point for me, because at that moment I got invited to the FBI National Executive Institute by governments around the world to help talk about cyber, build out cyber capacity, cyber crimes. I was in China, in Jamaica, in Dubai. I got travel, essentially traveling the world, talking and working as a member of the service as well, which was really cool because you're young and you're traveling the world. But then I kind of knew that it was time to move on. So I went to go do my MBA, lived in Scotland, did my MBA at the University of Edinburgh with an exchange at Peking University, and then got recruited by Microsoft. And when I was at Microsoft, there was a global center of innovation. We were talking about smart cities. We were talking about digital twins at the time. And there was this one moment where we're talking about technology and tech lawyers. Like you can imagine tech lawyers. And to me, like tech lawyers is there's technology and how do we navigate the technology? That was my understanding. But to a lot of people, tech lawyers were IP. It's intellectual property. It's patents. Is it copyright? Is it trademark? Is it? And I was like, well, what about everyday people that are getting victimized by cybercrime? Like, where do they turn? What do they do? What about businesses? And there were a few things that kind of happened in my life. And at that moment, I was like, okay, I'm going to go be a lawyer. So rolled my LSAT, went to the University of Ottawa, became a lawyer, and then kind of went on this tech law journey. And I'll stop talking now, but I think it's really important that, I got to where I am today. There wasn't a career path. There wasn't something that was prescriptive. It was just doing things, never saying no to opportunities. And here I am on your podcast.
Well, amazing. I mean, you covered a lot, and like that is a really amazing story, especially, it's like you said, right? A lot of the reasons for why you've kind of pursued entrepreneurship is because of survival, it's because of the circumstances that you were in. And it seems like, your path towards cybersecurity is also kind of similar to that, right? It's kind of just so happened that you kind of recruited into the, Toronto Police Service. It just so happened that you that you decided to life hack the police chief, right? So it seems like we all kind of like stumble on these things and we develop a passion for them as kind of like life takes us down these journeys. And I totally agree with like your sentiments at the end as well, where people oftentimes think about technology and law as like intellectual property or extremely technical like fields of practice. But I was like recently at a student event, which was like an open house welcoming incoming first years. And, as the president of Legal Innovation Hub, I was talking about how like, look, guys, like, sure, the IP is a very big part of like law and tech, but realize that technology is becoming so increasingly pervasive in all of our lives, whether it's the federal government using algorithmic decision making to kind of like decide who gets a tax credit, for example, or whether it's, police forces using predictive policing and stuff like that, that I'm sure, Ritesh maybe you can speak on in a little bit later as well. There's so many intersections between like law and technology that is not just confined to like the really technical things that you said. So I 100% really agree with that. And like,
Yeah.
yeah, no, go on, Ritesh, sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right. And I think that it's the journey, right? And it's kind of those moments that you can pinpoint. But again, like bringing it back to entrepreneurship, bringing it back to technology. It's not about IP. It is about IP. I think it is a big part of it, right? But we're seeing victimization happening left, right, and center using technology. We're seeing these tech companies that have become behemoths, and nothing wrong with that, right? But as long as we have the right processes in place to address victimization, just the other day I was on CBC talking about deep fakes, in particular nudes, and just how easy it is to create it. Obviously, for these apps are targeted towards creating fake nudes of young females, and there's disproportionate victimization there. But you could go on a search engine and look up nudify, and a bunch of apps come up, and some of them are open and free, and that is seems like just fundamentally wrong. And like, what do you do to get these images down? What do you do if you're a small business and all of a sudden there's a fake review with somebody who hasn't even been to your location that's writing these reviews, and you want to take it down because it's having an impact on your bottom line? And these are the real day issues that Canadians are dealing with. And when someone says tech law, that's what I think of, compared to kind of the more academic or IP related or policy related discussions that we traditionally have in our space.
I mean, Ritesh, one of the things that you sort of touched on that really resonated with me is the fact that, you're someone that's been trained in the legal profession. You have a background in cybersecurity. You've worked in law enforcement. So you have some of an understanding of how to sort of deal with some of these modern problems that we're going to be facing as we become more involved in digital spaces. For the average person, I mean, a lot of these problems cause a lot of fear, and there's sort of not as much guidance as to how they're going to progress towards these situations as they come up, as we move more towards our lives in digital spaces. And it's really interesting that you mentioned sort of how do we take action against a lot of these moral harms that happen in the digital space. Because yesterday at the University of Toronto, we had the chance to hear from Minister of Justice and Attorney General Arif Virani with regards to the most recent online harms bill. I guess sort of a question that I wanted to ask you is, how can we create frameworks to actually deal with a lot of the moral harms that happen in the digital space, but also balance that by making sure that we don't encumber rights to expression? What are the things that we should consider when trying to develop a framework for that kind of a problem?
So I think Minister Virani coming out with the online harms bill, Bill C-63, is a step in the right direction. As long as these bills get implemented properly and they do the appropriate studies, which they'll do when it's in its second reading. They'll have committees that come up, it gets studied, and then obviously the bill becomes law, and then the way it gets implemented is a whole other story. But I like the fact that there is this new digital safety commission. I think that's what they're calling it, and there's an ombudsperson as well, that promotes digital safety, that ensures that platforms are held accountable, that there is reports that are made public on what's actually being done to keep Canadians safe. I always thought like the way to go about this is like a principles-based approach. The one conversation that always resonates that I got to share, and I think that will answer your question and kind of put everything into perspective. I was having a conversation with a executive from a tech company, and they said, Ritesh, we are good corporate citizens and we should be allowed to share our product and make it available to the public because we follow Canadian laws. We're good. We follow the laws. And then in the next breath, the person said, it's not our fault that the laws are inadequate. And to me, it was that one moment. It was like that aha moment where I said, the law should not be the ceiling when it comes to this stuff. The law should be the floor. It's the bare minimum you have to do to participate within our spaces. But just to say that that's all you've done, that's not good enough. It's everything above that brings value to society, and society should reward and we should incentivize to go above that bar. If that bar is set low, that's the bare minimum you got to do. It's the floor, it's not the ceiling. So I think when it comes to these types of bills, when it comes to these types of frameworks, it's important to understand clearly there's a huge emphasis on protecting children. There's some national security components of this as well. Amendments to the criminal code, which are much needed, that come out of the bill. The creation of this new commission. That's all positive, and it's a step in the right direction. But when we get down to the nitty gritty, and the way it gets implemented, how quickly it gets implemented, for me, it's what I'm looking for is those principles, making sure that this is the floor, not the ceiling.
Yeah, 100%. And if I can, sorry, but did you want to add something or?
I was just going to say, I mean, it's so interesting when you describe it like that, because I think that when we think about any other sort of legal regulatory framework, even when we just think about general criminal prohibition, we never view the criminal code as the sort of basis for great civic engagement. We do view it as the floor. And to be an actual, productive member of society, our moral thresholds are much higher than just what the law says you can't do. There's sort of an active obligation to be a positive citizen, help out in your community, and all these different moral obligations. But as soon as we come to the online space, it's almost like we get away from that mentality. And instead, corporations view it as, oh, if the law says this, this is what we'll meet, but we won't go further than that. So do you think it is really a question of sort of applying the mindset we already have in society, but now to this digital space, which is new and sort of hasn't been viewed in that way in the past?
Absolutely. And it can't be a checkbox. It can't just be that, check, we've done it, right? We submitted a report, check. We're adhering to sections 1 through 8, check, or whatever. I'm just making up those numbers. But my point is that it can't be a checkbox exercise. This has to be a moving target. It needs to be continuous, and it needs to be reevaluated on a frequent basis. And this shouldn't go on regulators and governments to legislate. This should go on the platforms and to say, we have a moral obligation here. We have huge influence within society. Just imagine this. Imagine if social media companies were to shut down tomorrow. Some people would be like, yay, let's have a party. This is fantastic. We're going back, we can go back to, our life before social media. But this is the way Canadians coast to coast to coast are connected. This is the way they communicate. This is the way they receive their information. This is the way that they receive entertainment. Multiple small businesses, and I'm talking millions of small businesses, coast to coast to coast again, rely on social media. So if you were to shut it down, it would have a huge personal toll. It'd have a huge economic toll. So that's not the answer. Clearly, I think the answer here is that it requires engagement from multiple stakeholders, from society, from organizations, from these platforms, from governments as well, to all work together. This shouldn't be adversarial. This should be complementary. And I think if we can ever reach that, and I know that's me hoping here, but if we can ever reach that, then I think we get to that point where this is no longer checkbox, and it's something that we want to do this because we want to do it, not because we have to do it.
No, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with that. And like, I feel bad now because I don't want to be too much of a pessimist about things, but I totally agree that like, obviously we need to have engagement from many, many different stakeholders. There's different modalities of regulation, right? We have market, we have norms, we have like the law itself, we have the architecture of like the technology and how this like social media is structured, for instance. But in light of that, right, it's kind of hard to look past some of like the very big structural concerns when the government, puts their hand in a lot of like these things, right? So obviously the moving target is great, and being dynamic in how we apply these laws is really important. But I guess to some extent, this also cuts both ways, right? I think that like principles are obviously very important, but it's hard to ignore when you have, for example, like the commission that's set up. There's a lot of power that's vested into this commission, right? Which will have the primary responsibility in kind of enforcing this law. They can make rules on making certain content inaccessible. They have very broad investigation powers. They can have hearings that are closed to the public, and they can levy penalties. So I totally like agree in principle that the bill is something that's really important. It's something that needs to be addressed because there's huge regulatory gaps right now. But I was wondering, Ritesh, if you think that there are risks of like at least the current version of it going a little bit too far. If not, obviously I'd love to hear your reasons why, and if so, what are things we can do to kind of mitigate that in like future iterations of like either this bill or future regulations that are to be passed.
So it's going to be interesting to see kind of when big tech kind of comes out with their version or their of whether they support what elements they support, what elements they don't support, and that could kind of draw the line, right? What's going to be okay with them and what's not. My fear with these bills is that if they become too prescriptive, like clearly I believe it's 6%
Yes.
amps that can be levied on global revenue, right? So
Mhm.
that's a significant amount of money if you're a big tech firm. And we also got to remember, like, Canada is not we're not the biggest market. We're what, 40 million people out of that. Yes, we're highly connected. But what are we, 40 million, 38 million? I don't know what
Mhm.
the last time I checked the population was. Well, the US is 340 million people, so we're about 10% the size of the United States, right? Obviously, if you take the EU as a block, those numbers are much higher. Asia obviously completely dominates, right? Uh, we're talking billions of people. So we're not that big of a market. We're kind of a drop in the bucket for these tech firms. And I think what we've seen already, if we kind of look at what happened with news, right, in Canada, where Meta just said, well, we can't agree to this. There's no way we can agree to this, and they yanked news right off Instagram and Facebook, or I guess the Meta platform, depending on what whatever, I think it's still, we can we still call it Facebook? I guess we can still call it Facebook. But they yanked the news, and millions of Canadians that relied on getting their news through these channels are no longer able to get it. There were tons of content creators that were shut off as well, right? Saying like, well, this is my livelihood. I can't get the information. I can't talk about this information because I've been dubbed a media entity. A lot of media personalities were blocked as well. I remember going to following somebody, and all of a sudden they're like, I go to their page and it's this content is blocked in Canada. And there was a link taking me to why it was blocked, obviously because of the bill. We've seen recent as well with the Senate proposed bill on age verification. Pornhub comes out and says we're going to be suspending all activity or all within Canada. Now I know that the Canadians will figure out a way to circumvent a lot of these systems using VPNs and stuff like that. I'm not naive to that, but in principle, taking away the technical workarounds, the reality is that businesses are just gonna, and these platforms are, if they don't like what they hear, they're gonna pull out. And at the end of the day, that makes Canada less competitive. It means Canadians suffer, and it has a ripple effect on our economy and society. So my fear is, again, I don't know how far it goes, right? I don't know how the reaction is going to be. Is it going to be we embrace 90% of it? If we take Bill C-27, for example, right? There's kind of three parts to it. You got, that's the privacy legislation for those listening. You have the first part of it, which is the amendments to PIPEDA, obviously much needed, plain language doctrines, and I got to know what I'm hitting. I agree to. I think that's the big one for me. But amendments that are clearly needed, more powers to the OPC, to the Privacy Commissioner. I think that we can all agree to that. The second component is the creation of the tribunal. I think that makes a lot of sense. But the third component of this, the AI bill, is what a lot of companies came out against, right? What are high impact AI systems? We're okay with part one and part two, but we're not so okay with part three. And what does this mean? And does this mean that if I make all these investments in AI, that all of a sudden you're going to pass regulations or legislation and then regulations, and all of a sudden we can't do A, B, and C because there's ambiguity attached to it. So until you can give me specifics, I'm okay with one and two. That makes sense. But number three, I'm not okay. But this is like one shot, take it or leave it, right? So it's going to be interesting to see kind of as this goes through the legislative process, what the different tech firms are going to come out and say. And I think that's really going to shape the discussion in our country from a policy standpoint. But only time will tell. And your guess is as good as mine at this point.
I sort of want to follow up a little bit on the PIPEDA stuff that you were talking about earlier, because it sort of reminds me of a conundrum we were dealing with a few years ago. When PIPEDA was sort of amended or introduced in 2019, I had the chance to consult for this startup that was basically working on a process to let individuals know which companies currently stored their data. And then it would automate the deletion requests under PIPEDA for them. And it kind of made me think as I was doing that project, which is that like sometimes the government comes out with these regulatory legislative frameworks, but the average person has no idea how they can actually access them. Because I was like sitting there thinking to myself, like it's great now that the government has given me the ability to sort of take back some of my data, have it anonymized or have it deleted from these databases. But the average person probably is not going to send like 200 deletion emails to every single company. So I guess my question is sort of, even in circumstances where regulatory frameworks kind of catch up to the problems that we're dealing with, how do we sort of bridge the gaps between the government fixing the regulatory issues, but the consumers still not really understanding how to meaningfully exercise their rights, especially, I guess, in a data privacy context, but also generally broadly?
I think it comes down to education. I think it comes down to these types of podcasts and having how-to guides, simplifying this stuff, right, for the average user. I always said it's the key here is complexity simplified. You know, that would probably be the tagline, right? Is how do you do it in such a way that people are made aware of their rights? I think it comes down to education. It comes down to getting the word out, getting people the right tools so some of these things can be automated. In fact, when I was in law school, myself and two of my colleagues, we entered a Pan Canada tech law competition, and the whole idea was automating breach reporting for small businesses. Not only did we automate breach reporting, so you went in and filled out a survey. It auto-generated the PIPEDA forms. It auto-generated some free policies, gave you access to free training, and that's cybersecurity training, cybersecurity awareness. And there was another project as well that I had a chance to work on, and this is during the start of COVID, when everything was shutting down and people's airline tickets were being essentially canceled, and they weren't getting refunds. So myself and three colleagues, we built a automated airline refund app where you could just go in, again, fill out a survey, and it auto-generated all the documents you needed to serve under the U.S. Department of Transportation an enforcement notice requesting reimbursement from the airline. It automated everything, gave you a how-to guide. We even had a chance to partner with a leading consumer rights aviation expert. So Gabor Lukash, I think a lot of people do know who he is. He's on TV all the time when there's a issue with airlines. So, but it got a lot of coverage. I think like millions of dollars of refunds were generated. Whether people got the money back or not is a whole other story. But millions of dollars were essentially generated there in refund requests. But the reason that is because we were able to get the word out. It was timely. It actually made mainstream media. In fact, members of parliament actually connected with us as well, saying wanting to know more. And it had this ripple effect because people were upset. I was going to use a more harsher word, but they were really upset because their flights got canceled. You're sitting at home. You're trying to figure out what's happening when the world is shutting down, and all of a sudden these airlines aren't giving you a refund, and they're getting bailouts, right? So that really upsets people, right? From a consumer rights perspective, you're like, it's like, dude, where's my money, right? So that was kind of, it was timely, but it did get a lot of attention. And the moral of the story of that is, if you do something that's relevant, if you're able to relate to people on what you're doing, it comes down to a marketing exercise, right? And getting the word out, having the right tools to back it up, and having the support. So you kind of wrap it, you can give them the tools, you get the word out, and you wrap it with the right supports. Then you're really able to make a dent in this stuff. And yeah, then it's section whatever of a new act, the right to request a company to delete any information they may have of you, obviously non-commercial. Then at that point, it's here's what you do. Here's the easy 1, 2, 3 steps. You do it, and if it doesn't work, here's how you follow up and make a complaint. And you make it super simple, and you remove the legalese, and that's how you get those results.
It's so interesting because when we were doing the beta testing for that amendment about just deletion requests, basically in our consulting team, we would just send out like emails to all different companies for which we knew that there was consumer data that we had stored. And we just basically wanted to see if the companies themselves would comply or not. And it was interesting because some companies were very sort of with it. They were like, yeah, no, we know this. We know this has come into effect. Our compliance team has told us we'll delete the data, no problem. But some companies were kind of like, we don't even know what this is. Like, we have no idea what this law is. We don't know what you're talking about. We're going to need to investigate this further. So I guess my follow-up question is, did you sort of encounter not resistance from a lack of regulation, but instead sort of a lack of corporate education as to how to better engage in these consumer-oriented policies? And what's the sort of remedy for that going forward?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. Clearly, ignorance of the law is not an answer. However, not everyone's a lawyer, and I take it back to small to mid-sized businesses, right? That they don't have an in-house legal. They may not have the person that wears the privacy hat probably also wears the HR hat and the accounting hat. They wear multiple hats. They don't have you don't have someone dedicated to it. So, when you have these legislative amendments and you have new rules that come in, there has to be an education component to this. And I think the federal government definitely has to get better at it. So it's a lot simpler. I know there's resources, I know there's websites, I know there's tools, but if I'm working from 9 to 9, just trying to keep the lights on in my business, and I'm dealing with HR related issues, I'm dealing with customers, I'm dealing with wholesalers, I'm dealing with the increased cost of goods, I'm dealing with accounts receivable and getting paid on time. This is one extra thing I got to worry about. I might have legacy systems. I might have systems that don't allow for auto deletion upon request. It might be a much more tedious process instead of something that's streamlined and automated, right? So I think that it comes down to education, providing the right tools, and just understanding that at the end of the day, there are human beings behind this, right? And if we take a human-centric approach, an empathy-based approach, saying like, okay, we've passed these laws, but now we got to get the word out. Now we actually have to help people get in compliance, not just say, well, here's a law and here you got to get into compliance. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually want to follow up on this conversation a little bit more about how, there are some exemptions for kind of certain corporations that don't require them to de-identify data and stuff like that in the way that maybe, I don't know, like a crown corporation would, or for example, a government entity would. But I think like what's troubling though is like, I think I read this from a recent report on algorithmic policing, where through things like social media surveillance, through facial recognition technology, through social network analysis and data-driven policing, a lot of police forces, like I'm pretty sure it's like the Vancouver Police Force, I think the Toronto Police Force might have used it, I don't fully remember, but they have relationships with companies like IBM or like Environics or NEC Corp or Salesforce to kind of supply the information and architecture that they need to engage in like very kind of troubling uses of that data to determine where to allocate police resources and stuff like that. So do you think like there's like a structural problem with how the system is set up? Like should we have like this very clear barrier between the ways that government entities or at least police forces are able to kind of interact with private corporations, or is the solution just to make it so that no private entity should be able to kind of collect and use our data or sell our data in that way, which to me obviously seems extremely unfeasible? I know that's a very big question, but yeah, I was curious what your thoughts were on that.
It's actually a fantastic question. Something that I've been following very closely. I got firsthand knowledge of a lot of the systems and software that has been used. So my personal experience, and I think we got to remove the noise, right? I think my personal experience is that there is a framework now that, especially after post Clearview AI, which was the facial recognition software that got a lot of scrutiny. I just want to actually preface this by saying there is no investigator or police officer that I have ever met in my entire career, and I have come across thousands of police officers and investigators in my career. who has ever said, oh, let me get this piece of software because it's going to violate the civil rights of somebody, right? That has never to date ever happened. In fact, they're like, oh, this is a new shiny thing that might help me catch a bad person and help a victim because I can easily identify someone. So, that's the intent of these police officers. Now, these police officers aren't lawyers, they're not privacy experts, right? So this is where the system comes in. Before any vendor is able to get to a police service and say, hey, I got this new shiny thing, or hey, check out this tool. That tool might have very valid purposes and reasons for its use. That doesn't mean you should be able to use it. And there should be a privacy impact assessment that's done. There should be a third party that provides a legal opinion. If it's a police service or government entity, you have access to crowns, right? Whether it be the Ministry of the Attorney General or the Department of Justice or whatever that kind of, that you could bring in to do these reviews. And you do the review from a legal standpoint, a cyber security standpoint, a data sovereignty standpoint, a privacy standpoint, right? You kind of tick off all those boxes. If it involves AI, there should be additional scrutiny as well. For example, algorithmic bias that may be built in. And what are you going? And then what are you going now? If it goes through all that, there might be safeguards that need to be put in place. If you're going to use this, you need to create a business case, or you need to seek permission from this particular individual, or these tools will only be housed within particular units, and a formal written request must be done. I think that you could put these parameters and safeguards in place, which police services are doing, by the way. I think they do have these processes now in place. There was another component of that question, which is circumventing systems. So instead of police having to do A, B, and C, if a private entity has that data already, can they just buy that data, right, and use that data? The short answer is no, right? It's a complex question, but the short answer is no, right? I think if you're going to be using any systems, you got to have that framework in place, being a government agency or a law enforcement agency, where I got this tool or I got access to this data, which is something, obviously technology is evolving at a rapid pace. So this, again, this can't be a checkbox that needs to be continuous, because you and I both know that there's new features added all the time. Just look at our phones, right? Go into these apps and all of a sudden you got a new feature. Do you want to unlock with your Face ID? Do you want to, store this data? Do you want to log into this app using this app credentials, right? For single sign-on. Do you want to share data amongst these apps? Tracking, right? Like, we keep getting these things, updates on a frequent basis. So that's what I mean. It can't be a checkbox. It needs to be continuous. And as long as they follow that framework of the security, the privacy, if it involves AI, making sure that there's no bias, making sure that there is particular safeguards that are put in place, that there's oversight, then yes, I think there's a expectation by the public that law enforcement and government are using the best and latest and greatest technology to deliver service and keep us safe. But at the same time, it's important that it's legal, secure, and privacy focused, because the alternative is a world that I don't want to live in.
One of the things that I'm sort of gathering from our discussion right now is that we're sort of in a period of great change as it relates to the law and technology, and sort of every day we're going to keep coming across new things for which we're going to have to keep adapting. It kind of reminds me of how a few years ago I was at a conference where I met a lawyer from a Bay Street firm. And one of the things that he talked about was his practice area related more to cybercrime and cybersecurity and dealing with ransomware attacks. And it really sort of changed my understanding of what a lawyer could be, because historically you're sort of always told in law school you're going to be a transactional attorney, you're going to be a litigator. Those are sort of your two pathways. And then there was this guest speaker who was telling me that his day-to-day job basically revolved around ensuring that companies that were the victims of ransomware attacks were able to do things like either get access to a decryptor or come up with some sort of a strategy to manage that situation. And it completely sort of blew my mind as to what a lawyer could be. The reason why I bring this up is because I did see that you spoke on CTV News about the Indigo ransomware attacks that have happened recently. And I guess my question to you with regards to not just that incident, but ransomware attacks in general, is that do you think that law as an industry really is going to have to change because the problems that lawyers are going to have to deal with keep getting more complex, but substantively different than the problems that we're used to in the legal field?
So the Law Society requires that you're competent, right? That you have technological competencies as a lawyer in Ontario. Like that's one of your requirements, right? So it's important to stay up to date as technology changes because we're talking about ransomware and kind of that transactional bit of I have a client that's been hacked, I got a client that's been breached, a client that's dealing with a fake review, whatever. Like I get that, right? But what if you as a lawyer, you're going to have to deal with this as well. You're going to get attachments, you're going to get files, you're going to have to think about keeping client information secure, right? There's a duty of confidentiality, attorney-client privilege, right? That is very sacred in our profession, right? This is why we do what we do, right? So clearly, I think it's as lawyers, we need to really figure out how technology is evolving, how technology can be leveraged, and how that technology could also be weaponized against us or our clients, and ensure that we put the right mechanisms in place. Personal usage is a precondition to comprehension. If you're not using this technology yourself, if you're not living in this space or understanding how you could be a victim of ransomware. I give talks all the time to media, as you mentioned, talks public as well, podcasts, where I talk about. I kind of break it up into three categories when it comes to these types of incidents. I break it up into our ability to prevent it in the first place. So having the right education, understanding, do we have the right software? Are we doing our updates regularly? My second bucket is detection. How do you actually know you're getting hacked? Does it mean you can't get into something? Do you get alerts? Does the sirens go off? You can really think about how do you detect this stuff? It's one thing to have logs. Who's watching those logs? Who's reading those logs? What happens if it happens 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday? What are you going to do? Right. So, and the third component is respond. How are you going to respond? Are you going to respond when a client calls you and says, I've been hacked? Are you going to respond if you all of a sudden can't get into your own files and you have very sensitive client-related files as well? So, yeah, I think when it comes to ransomware, when it comes to cyber, when it comes to technology, I think we have a duty to understand what is the threat landscape out there, but also how emerging technology can add value to our clients. You can obviously think about during COVID, and even to this day, right? Zoom court is a thing. I think I've personally been to court twice, 3 times, right? For something. The majority of my stuff has been over Zoom. It's been great. It's great for the client. They save a lot of money. It's great for us as lawyers as well. People I also feel are more comfortable in their home office or in their actual office at work than they would, having to dress up, drive to a courthouse and spend all that time, right? Again, there's certain things that just can't be avoided, but there's other things that bring value. One of the things that I do on every year with the University of Ottawa faculty of the common law section is the virtual reality moot. We actually hold a moot in VR. And the idea of the moot isn't, and a lot of people are like, oh, Ritesh, that's really gimmicky. Like, we're going to have people as avatars in court. No, we're not going to have people as avatars in court. We already know that. In fact, year one, we did it. There was this idea of we're the first. It's the first moot in the VR, or the first moot in the metaverse. And one of the judges we had, it was former Supreme Court Justice Ian Binney. That was a part of it. We also had Ontario Court of Justice Justice Jody Lynn Waddlove as well, and we've had additional judges as well. And the idea is year one is this is the art of the possible. Year two, we actually introduced digital evidence where we created a 3D rendition of a sneaker. And the judges were actually able to hold a sneaker. It was a contract law case on, just because a sneaker is authentic, is it a collectible, and was it a breach of contract or a frustration of contract case? And then the last one we did is probably the most realistic way of doing it. It was a physical moot, but then we went into virtual exhibit A. It was a slip and fall. What was the lighting conditions? Where was the sign placed? And I think that was the most realistic application. And obviously, we're going to keep innovating, and we got some really cool things that we're going to do next year. Just throwing a little plug in there for anyone that wants to check it out. But that's emerging technology. If you don't understand AI or generative AI by now, get on it, right? Because that's having a huge impact in the legal space as well. Obviously we hear about the dark and gloomy stuff of AI hallucinations and lawyers getting sanctioned for using ChatGPT and it generates fake case law, and that never happened, and they cite it. That's just laziness, right? But the technology can be used to automate a lot of things and bring down costs and speed up timelines and make what we all talk about, access to justice, more prevalent. So I'll kind of leave it at that. But it's not just about ransomware and emerging technology. It's about how we can leverage this stuff. The fact that we do need to have competence in this. But also, at the end of the day, this stuff is very powerful and promotes access to justice.
I mean, I completely would like to echo that. I mean, we do see a lot of the sort of scary aspects of AI and technology, but last summer I did have the chance to work at Blue Jay, which is doing, generative AI in the tax law space. And it was really cool to see firsthand all of the useful applications that are going to come forward to help sort of lawyers in the future develop their abilities and get better at things like legal research, and using that better to serve clients. And that sort of optimistic outlook is something that I definitely developed there. And I guess, your comments sort of helped to put into perspective the fact that as scared as we are of a lot of the problems that, the technology is going to create in law, there's a lot to be optimistic about as well. So I think that's definitely something great for us to look forward to as future members of the legal profession.
Yeah, and also legal education, right, for members of the public, but also for us as you guys, like as going through law school, and myself, we read Supreme Court cases most of the time, but we forget that there's people behind these cases. These cases take years to get to the Supreme Court. There's real life people there. There's people's their lives that are at stake for it to get to the Supreme Court. And I always thought one of the most impactful law lectures we had was they actually brought in one of the individuals that was involved in a Supreme Court case. And you actually hear their story, and you heard about the other side of actually kind of being that initial case that started off, I think, at the Ontario Court of Justice and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. I think it started in Superior Court and went up, if I'm not mistaken. But regardless, it was, there's people behind these cases. And I always thought, like, with emerging technology, there's a really cool way of, making the learning of law that much more immersive. Being able as lawyers to use generative AI and virtual reality to practice, to get better at the softer skills of lawyering, being able to continue, get your own personal assistant and tutor that can explain what some of these laws mean, what the terminology means, what some of these Latin terms mean, of course. There's a real opportunity here, and I think that there is a lot more that can be done and is being done, and it's an exciting time to be a lawyer and to be a law student.
Absolutely. And like, I actually wanted to follow up on that as well, which is, as we kind of are nearing the end, obviously, I know we have time for maybe one more question as well, but like to talk about something a little bit more theoretical, I wanted to kind of briefly touch on the metaverse as well. And I was actually there to watch the VR moot that you were talking about at Ottawa. It was really, really cool. And it actually speaks to something really interesting, where it seems like with things like the metaverse, with the Apple Vision Pro, like we're making our way towards an increasing like immaterial public space. And I think that as lawyers, then the challenge is how to adapt our understanding of rights and things like that to this evolution too. So obviously there's harms to like from deep fakes, from cyber assaults and defamation that tort law doesn't adequately protect against. I know that you recently worked on a report from like Interpol that talked about how we can enforce legal rights and how to, you know, evolve our understanding of rights with like something like the metaverse. And I was wondering where you think that's headed and how that is likely to affect, you know, us as lawyers and how we should adjust the way that we practice kind of going into like this world that is completely different than how we've like previously understood it like in the past.
Look, we got it down in the physical world. We know exactly what to do. Then we kind of, I think around March 2020, when the world went online, we got really good at the virtual world. And now we're kind of getting into this new world where physical and virtual converge. We're in this convergent world. Different brands have put different spins on it, whether it be the metaverse, whether it be extended reality. It's all this convergent world of the physical and virtual coming together. I get back to my previous point, and that is personal usage is a precondition to comprehension. It's one thing to talk about it, but the fact that you actually attended the VR moot, right? The fact that you're able to test out some of the technology and see it firsthand, that is the step in the right direction. We can have informed discussions about victimization. We can have informed discussions around leveraging new opportunities if we don't actually get into the technology. Instead of just saying, "Oh no, this is something that will never work," and then you get hit with a tsunami of information and and all of a sudden everyone's doing it. And you're like, "Oh man, I kind of missed that one." And we've seen this time in and time out. We're very reactive in certain cases, and I think now is the time for us to be a lot more proactive, get ahead of the curve, test out some of these technologies. Because as you mentioned, that report from Interpol that I had a chance to be a contributor on, I talked a lot. It was more focused on the digital forensics of these headsets and what type of information could actually be gleaned. And I kind of brought some of the legal perspective of it as well. There's obviously jurisdictional issues. If we're in a workspace or in a workroom and we're all avatars, how do I verify that it's that person that I'm actually discussing? Clearly the Law Society has rules around payments. Well, I think there's groups in the United States that are. I saw a fantastic demo. They created like a law firm in the metaverse, and they were willing to accept payments through digital or cryptocurrencies, right? And I was like, well, that's interesting, right? Like how you would value that. I think it would be you would still have the same rules around it. You would just take the current day conversion of it. But how do you trace that, right? How do you trace to make sure that it's from legitimate sources? There's all these questions that come up. But if you don't have a wallet, a digital wallet, if you haven't used one of these headsets, if you're not playing around with different AI softwares and platforms, you won't be able to have an informed discussion about this. And we can't talk about the victimization, and we definitely can't talk about the opportunities, because then you're theoretical. You're not practical. And I think what you'll notice is once you start taking the practicality components of this, there's a world of opportunity, and your eyes do open up to this new convergent world, which inevitably we're all going to be living in. So it's either, do it today, or you're going to be forced to do it tomorrow, and nobody likes being forced.
Ritesh, I mean, sort of just to sort of close this off, I mean, the big question that I really have is, from our conversation so far, it really does seem like, regardless of whether or not someone wants to go into technology law, being technologically literate is going to be necessary regardless of what aspect of law you end up practicing in the 21st century. Given that law school traditionally is much more of a conservative organization, what recommendations do you give to students that are currently going through law school in terms of the opportunities they can take advantage of to sort of supplement their legal education with some of the technological implications that their profession is going to have?
expand your horizons. Just because you're in law school doesn't mean you don't have opportunities to do these meetups with other faculties. Some of the best learnings I got were going to the business school, going to the engineering building. There's tons of joint events that happen as well. There's events that happen within the corporate world as well, and student tickets are usually free. Great networking opportunities, but you also get to hear about tech. You also get to hear about, for my case, it was technology. I was always into the tech stuff, right? But I remember going to a conference, and it was an art conference. I got asked to speak at it, and I usually just go into these conferences, do my thing, and leave. But this one, I was like, it's not every day I get to go to an art or fashion conference, right? And so I went there. I got asked to moderate a panel, and the amount of digital art and digital fashion and the amount of technology that was being put into it. It was fascinating because there was a demo that was set up where you could literally, like, kind of like a filter, what you would look like with certain type of makeup, or what you would look like in particular clothes, and you could literally like stand in front of a mirror and voila, it's on you, right? And you're like, oh, that's really neat. But that was, they didn't dub that as a tech conference. They dubbed that as a fashion conference. And there was, tech related components. Same thing with agriculture as well. I know we're concluding, so I'll just conclude with this comment because this really stuck with me. And as lawyers, we love acronyms. PIPEDA, for example. We love our acronyms. But I recently spoke at a agriculture conference. In fact, it was related to the pork industry, swine. It's funny because I'm a vegetarian. So I was like, is there a right of entry if I'm vegetarian? Like, can I still get in? Clearly, I was still allowed in. And I spoke the entire time about AI. And AI and ag tech, AI and security, and I was quite amazed as well because when I was looking at the agenda, it said the do's and don'ts of AI. It said advancements in AI, and this was a conference with farmers and producers. And afterwards, I get as I was talking, a lot of people were laughing. And I was like, I wonder why, like, I know, am I like a stand-up comedian all of a sudden? Like, am I, cybersecurity is not a really funny topic, but that's okay. Maybe it's my humor, it's my smile. And a farmer came up to me afterwards and he goes, Ritesh, fantastic presentation. I enjoyed it. But just so you know, when you say AI in our world, it doesn't mean artificial intelligence. It means artificial insemination. Right. So I was like, oh man, okay, all right. So the do's and don'ts of AI and me thinking there's all these conversations about AI was actually around artificial insemination. But the point, it was kind of like a fun way to kind of end off. But my point is that uh, expand your horizons. Just get out of that law school mentality, like walls, and understand that there is an entire ecosystem that's out there. And as a student, is the best time to learn. It's the best time to try things. And it's okay if things don't work out. I have a good friend of mine, and he shared a quote with me, and he goes, Ritesh, don't embrace if you fail. And I was like, really? And he goes, yeah, you know what that means? I was like, what? He goes, it's your first attempt in learning. That's what it means to fail. So as a law student, this is the time to try things out. And if things don't work out, it's a learning opportunity. But don't say no to opportunities. Expand your horizons. Keep at it. Listen to this podcast. And that's how you'll be able to really set yourself apart and get ready for the challenges of tomorrow today.
Amazing. I mean, great closer. And as both of you have made clear, we are unfortunately reaching the end of our time. And it feels like any one of these topics could be like an hours long podcast episode itself. And one of the things that Vidit and I were really struggling with in preparation for this was like not like what to talk about, but rather like where do we even like begin? So with that being said, I was going to ask you to do some closing thoughts and something you thought was important and maybe we didn't get to touch on, but it seems like you closed it off absolutely perfectly. And I'd love to maybe have you add if you could maybe provide the viewers with where they can find you and keep up with the work that you do. And just like general things that or like general resources that you'd like to point the viewers to if they want to really break into this space.
Absolutely. So I think if you want to connect with me, I'm available on X. I'm available on LinkedIn. It's at Ritesh Kotak. I do have a website, which is riteshkotak.com. And I think, reach out to me. I do answer, I personally answer my own messages. It's not done by an AI bot or anything. And I look forward to connecting with the listeners, connecting with the viewers, and connecting with just about any law student. I think this is the time to reach out, to ask questions, and I think maybe both of you can attest to this. I do try to make myself available, and I'm here, especially as you go through your journey. If I can be of any assistance, let me know.
Absolutely. I mean, I can definitely testify to that. You have been always extremely responsive. As I said at the very beginning of the podcast episode, you're one of the most down-to-earth people that I know. And I really, really appreciate the fact that you've taken time out of your busy schedule to come onto the podcast. And obviously, I want to extend my thanks to my co-host Vidit as well for contributing to such an amazing conversation. I do remember at the very beginning, before you arrived, Ritesh, I was talking to Vidit, and I was like, yeah, I was looking at Ritesh's LinkedIn, and I saw he was on CBC a couple of days ago, and I was like, it's really cool that he's making the time for us, and we really appreciate the work that you do, the contributions that you have towards this industry. And yeah, we really hope to maybe have you back on sometime to talk about other things that you're working on. I'm sure there's no shortage of that. So thank you so much. And Vidit, if you want to offer some of your kind of closing remarks too, and we can maybe wrap it up there.
I'm exceptionally grateful that you made the time to come speak with us. I mean, it is tough to get a podcast off the ground, so the fact that you came and made the time and sort of gave us a bit more perspective on how this industry is changing is incredibly helpful, not just for myself and Tyler, but for all the students that are watching right now that are trying to navigate some of the challenges that are going to affect this industry. So just to echo Tyler, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.